The Revelation of 900 Painters. A hidden truth unveiled. The discovery. Dr. Sarah Mitchell had always been drawn to the forgotten corners of history. As a professor of historical archaeology at Cambridge University, she spent her days sifting through dusty archives and examining artifacts that others had overlooked. But nothing could have prepared her for what she would discover on that foggy November morning. The call came from her colleague, Professor James Whitmore, who worked at the British Museum's private collection department. His voice trembled with excitement as he spoke through the crackling phone line. "Sarah, you need to come here immediately. We found something extraordinary, something that could change everything we know about the early 20th century." Within an hour, Sarah found herself standing in the museum's restricted archive, surrounded by towering shelves filled with catalogued mysteries. James led her to a small, climate-controlled room where a single photograph lay on a white examination table, illuminated by precise LED lighting. The photograph was remarkably well preserved for its age, printed on the heavy paper stock common in. The image showed what appeared to be a gathering of well-dressed individuals in formal attire, standing before an ornate building that Sarah didn't immediately recognize. But it wasn't the people or the architecture that made her breath catch in her throat. In the background of the photograph, partially obscured by shadows but unmistakably present, was a structure that shouldn't have existed in. It was sleek, metallic, and bore a striking resemblance to technology that wouldn't be developed for decades to come. "Where did this come from?" Sarah whispered, leaning closer, examining the details. James pulled out a manila folder, thick with documentation. It was part of a private estate donation. The family had kept it in a safety deposit box for nearly a century. According to the accompanying documents, it was taken by a journalist named Theodore Blackwood during what was supposed to be a routine social gathering in London. Sarah's mind raced as she studied the photograph more carefully. The faces in the image were sharp and clear, and she recognized several prominent figures from the 1920s political and business world, but the mysterious structure in the background defied explanation. "Have you shown this to anyone else?" she asked. "Only you. I thought, given your expertise in historical anomalies, you'd be the right person to help me understand what we're looking at here." As Sarah continued to examine the photograph, she noticed something else that made her pulse quicken. In the corner of the image, barely visible, was a symbol etched into the stone of the building. It was a complex geometric design that she had seen before, but only in much older contexts. Ancient texts and artifacts that predated the photograph by thousands of years. The symbol appeared to be a combination of interlocking circles and angular lines, forming a pattern that seemed to shift and change depending on the angle from which it was viewed. Sarah had encountered similar markings in her research on medieval alchemical texts and even older Celtic stone carvings, but seeing it in a 1923 photograph created an unsettling sense of continuity across centuries. "James," she said slowly, "I think we're looking at evidence of something that was deliberately hidden from history. This isn't just an unusual photograph, it's proof of a secret that someone went to great lengths to bury." The implications were staggering. If the photograph was authentic, and if her initial assessment was correct, then everything they thought they knew about technological development and historical timelines might be fundamentally wrong. "We need to authenticate this immediately," Sarah continued. "Carbon dating, paper analysis, incomposition, everything. And we need to research Theodore Blackwood. If he took this photograph, there might be more evidence of what he discovered." James nodded, his excitement palpably. "I've already started preliminary research on Blackwood. What I've found so far is troubling. It disappeared in 1924, just months after this photograph was supposedly taken. No trace of him was ever found." Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. The photograph was no longer just a historical curiosity. It was potentially the key to understanding a conspiracy that had been hidden for a century. As they carefully secured the photograph in a protective case, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The weight of the discovery pressed down on her, and she realized that uncovering this secret might be more dangerous than either of them had anticipated. "We need to be careful about who we trust with this information," she warned James. "If this photograph represents what I think it does, there are people who have spent a century keeping this secret buried. They won't appreciate us digging it up." The fluorescent lights in the archive room seemed to flicker momentarily, casting strange shadows across the walls lined with historical artifacts. Sarah noticed that several of the other items in the collection bore similar markings to the symbol she had identified in the photograph. It was as if the museum itself was a repository for evidence of this hidden history. "James, look at this," she said, pointing to a medieval manuscript displayed in a nearby case. "That same symbol appears here, and here." She moved to another display. "And in this Renaissance painting, whatever this organization is, they've been operating for much longer than just the 20th century. The revelation added another layer of complexity to the discovery. They weren't just dealing with a modern conspiracy, they were looking at evidence of a secret society that had maintained its influence across centuries, carefully documenting its activities while keeping them hidden from public view. As they prepared to leave the archive, Sarah made mental notes of all the artifacts that bore the mysterious symbol. She would need to return and study them more carefully. But for now, the 1923 photograph remained their most concrete piece of evidence. The security guard who escorted them out of the restricted area seemed unusually interested in the research, asking several questions about their findings. Sarah answered vaguely, but she noticed the guard making notes on a small pad of paper. Another reminder that the investigation was already attracting unwanted attention. The next morning, Sarah arrived at her office before dawn, unable to sleep after the previous day's discovery. She had spent the night researching Theodore Blackwood, and what she had found only deepened the mystery surrounding the photograph. Blackwood had been a respected investigative journalist for the London Chronicle, known for his meticulous research and fearless pursuit of truth. His articles from the early 1920s revealed a man deeply concerned with the growing influence of secret societies and private organizations that seemed to operate beyond the reach of government oversight. Sarah spread copies of Blackwood's articles across her desk, looking for any connection to the photograph. One article published in March titled "The Shadow Builders, Secret Societies and Hidden Agendas." It detailed Blackwood's investigation into a group he called the Architects. According to the article, the Architects were a secretive organization composed of wealthy industrialists, politicians, and scientists who met regularly to discuss what Blackwood's termed projects of unprecedented scope and ambition. They had been trying to infiltrate one of their gatherings when he disappeared. Sarah's phone rang, interrupting her research. It was James, calling from the museum's laboratory. "Sarah, you need to hear this. We've completed the preliminary analysis of the photograph, and the results are impossible." "What do you mean, impossible?" "The paper, the ink, the chemical composition, everything dates to 1923, exactly as expected. But there's something else. We found traces of materials in the photograph that shouldn't exist, elements that weren't discovered until decades later." Sarah's heart raced. "Are you saying the photograph is authentic?" "I'm saying that according to every test we can perform, this photograph was definitely taken in Sarah, what we're seeing in this image challenges everything we understand about technological development in the early 20th century. After ending the call, Sarah returned to her research with renewed urgency. She pulled up digital archives of newspapers from 1923 and 1924, searching for any mention of unusual events or mysterious disappearances around the time Blackwood vanished. What she found made her blood run cold. Between November 1923 and March 1924, at least 12 prominent scientists, engineers, and journalists had disappeared without a trace. All of them had been investigating similar leads to Blackwood, secret meetings, unusual technological developments, and the activities of powerful private organizations. The pattern was too consistent to be coincidental. Someone had been systematically eliminating people who had gotten too close to the truth. Sora printed out everything she could find about the disappearances and cross-referenced the names with Blackwood's articles. Several of the missing individuals had been mentioned in his reporting as sources or fellow investigators. Among the disappeared was Dr. Marcus Thornfield, a brilliant physicist who had been working on what he called energy transmission without wire. His laboratory had been destroyed in a mysterious fire just days before his disappearance. Another was Elena Vasquez, a Spanish engineer who had developed early prototypes of mechanical calculating machines. She had vanished while traveling to London to present her work to potential investors. The most disturbing case was that of Professor William Chen, a Chinese-American scientist who had been researching what he termed thinking machines, early concepts for artificial intelligence. His research notes had disappeared along with him, and his university claimed no record of his work had ever existed. As she worked, Sarah became increasingly aware of her surroundings. Every footstep in the hallway outside her office made her look up nervously. Every phone call seemed potentially threatening. The weight of the secret she was uncovering pressed down on her like a physical force. Her computer chimed with an incoming email. The sender's address was unfamiliar, but the subject line made her freeze. "Stop digging, Dr. Mitchell." With trembling fingers, she opened the message. It contained only a single line of text. "Some secrets are buried for good reason. Theodore Blackwood learned this lesson. Don't repeat his mistake." Attached to the email was a photograph, a modern image of Sarah herself, taken from outside her office window. Just hours earlier, someone had been watching her, documenting her research, and now they were making their presence known. Sarah's office suddenly felt too exposed, too vulnerable. She quickly gathered all her research materials and the copies of Blackwood's articles, stuffing them into her briefcase. Whatever she had stumbled into, it was clear that the same forces that had silenced Blackwood were still active. She called James immediately. "We need to meet somewhere private, away from the museum, away from the university." "And James, bring the photograph." "Sarah, what's wrong? You sound terrified." "I just received a threat. They know we're investigating, and they're watching us. We need to be very careful from now on." As Sarah prepared like and leave her office, she noticed something that made her blood freeze. The security camera in the corner of the room, a camera that had been broken for months, was now operational, its red recording light blinking steadily. Someone had repaired it without her knowledge, and they had been monitoring her research. She grabbed her laptop and briefcase, but as she reached for the door handle, she heard footsteps in the corridor outside. Heavy, deliberate footsteps that stopped directly outside her office. Sarah held her breath, waiting to see if whoever was out there would try to enter. After what felt like an eternity, the footsteps moved away, but Sarah knew she couldn't stay in her office any longer. She slipped out through a side exit and made her way to her car, constantly checking over her shoulder for signs of surveillance. As she drove through the Cambridge streets, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that she was being followed. Every car behind her seemed suspicious, every pedestrian potentially threatening. The photograph from 1923 had opened the door to a world of secrets and danger that she was only beginning to understand, but there was no turning back now. Theodore Blackwood had died trying to expose the truth, and Sarah was determined to finish what he had started, no matter what the cost. The small cafe in Camden was nearly empty at 3 in the afternoon, making it perfect for a clandestine meeting. Sarah's had chosen a corner with clear sight lines to all entrances, a precaution that would have seemed paranoid just days earlier, but now felt essential. James arrived carrying a nondescript leather satchel, his usual academic composure replaced by nervous energy. He slid into the seat across from Sarah and immediately leaned forward. "I received a call this morning," he whispered. "Someone claiming to be from the museum's board of directors. They wanted to know about our recent acquisitions, specifically any photographs from them." Sarah felt her stomach drop. "What did you tell them?" "I played dumb, said we hadn't processed anything significant recently. But Sarah, I've been on the museum's board communications for 15 years. I know every member personally, and the voice on the phone wasn't familiar." Sarah pulled out her laptop and showed James the threatening email she had received. His face paled as he read it. "This is escalating quickly," he said. "Maybe we should turn everything over to the authorities and tell them what? That we found a photograph that proves advanced technology existed in me. They'll think we're conspiracy theories." Sarah opened her briefcase and pulled out the research she had compiled. "Besides, I think the authorities might already be compromised." She spread Blackwood's articles across the table, pointing to specific passages she had highlighted. "Look at this. Blackwood mentions that several government officials were present at the secret meetings he was investigating. If the architects had influence in government circles in 1993, who's to say that influence doesn't still exist today?" James studied the articles carefully. These names, some of them are familiar. Not the individuals themselves, but the family names. Several of these surnames belong to people who are still prominent in politics and business today. Exactly. We're not just dealing with a historical mystery, we're dealing with a conspiracy that spans generations. Sarah pulled up a genealogy website on her laptop and began tracing the family lines of the individuals mentioned in Blackwood's articles. What she found confirmed her worst fears. The descendants of the architects had indeed maintained their influence. They occupied positions of power in government, media, technology companies, and financial institutions. The network that Blackwood had begun to expose in 1923 had not only survived, but had grown stronger over the decades. "Look at this," Sarah said, pointing to her screen. "Charles Whitfield, mentioned in Blackwood's article as a founding member of the architects. His great-grandson, David Whitfield, is currently the CEO of Whitfield Industries, one of the largest technology conglomerates in the world." The Whitfield family tree revealed a pattern of strategic marriages and business alliances that had consolidated power across multiple industries. David Whitfield's company controlled patents in artificial intelligence, quantum computing, and advanced material science. His board of directors included members of other families mentioned in Blackwood's research. And here, Sarah continued, clicking to another family tree, Margaret Harrington, descendant of the banking family that financed many of the architects' early operations. She's now the chairman of the Global Economic Forum and sits on the boards of 3 major central banks. James leaned back in his chair, overwhelmed by the implications. "So what are you suggesting?" "That this conspiracy has been operating for a century, suppressing technological advancement and eliminating anyone who gets too close to the truth. I'm suggesting that the photograph we found is evidence of technology that was deliberately hidden from the world. Think about it. What if human civilization could have advanced much faster than it did? What if the technology we're just developing now could have been available decades ago?" Sarah pulled up additional research she had compiled about technological development patterns. "Look at this timeline. Major breakthroughs in computing, communications, and energy technology all seem to follow a very specific pattern. They emerge just when they're needed to solve particular problems, but never fast enough to disrupt existing power structures." "You're talking about controlled technological release," James said, beginning to understand the scope of what they were uncovering. "Exactly. What if the architects have been managing the pace of human technological development for over a century, releasing innovations only when they serve their purposes, suppressing discoveries that might threaten their control? Sarah's phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. Café Camden, leave now. You're being watched. Both Sarah and James looked around the cafe nervously. The few other patrons seemed ordinary enough. A student with a laptop, an elderly man reading a newspaper, a woman with a baby stroller. But suddenly, every one of them seemed potentially threatening. The student hadn't typed anything on his laptop in the past 20 minutes, despite appearing to be working. The elderly man had been reading the same page of his newspaper since they arrived. The woman with the baby stroller had positioned herself where she could observe their entire conversation. "We need to go," Sarah said, quickly gathering her materials. "And we need to find somewhere safe to continue this investigation." As they prepared to leave, James grabbed her arm. "Sarah, there's something else. I didn't want to mention it over the phone, but we found more than just the photograph in that estate donation. There was also a journal, Theodore Blackwood's journal, and according to his final entries, he had discovered something even more shocking than secret technology." "What?" He believed that the architects weren't just suppressing technology, they were actively manipulating historical events, wars, economic collapses, political upheavals, all orchestrated to maintain their control over human development. Sarah felt the world shift around her. If Blackwood's theory was correct, then the photograph was just the tip of an iceberg that went much deeper than technological suppression. They were looking at evidence of a group that had been steering the course of human history for over a century. The implications were staggering. Every major conflict, every economic crisis, every social upheaval of the past 100 years might have been deliberately engineered by the architects to serve their vision of controlled human development. As they left the cafe through separate exits, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that they had crossed a point of no return. The secret they were uncovering was too big, too dangerous to ignore, but pursuing it further might cost them everything, including their lives. Sarah walked quickly through the crowded Camden streets, constantly checking reflections in shop windows to see if she was being followed. The weight of Blackwood's journal in James's possession felt like a ticking time bomb. Whatever secrets it contained had been worth killing for. In 1924, and she had no doubt they would be worth killing for today. The photograph from 1923 had been just the beginning. Now they were about to uncover the full scope of a conspiracy that had shaped the entire course of human civilization. Sarah's flat in Bloomsbury had never felt more like a fortress. She had drawn all the curtains, checked the locks twice, and positioned herself at her kitchen table with a clear view of both entrances. James sat across from her, Blackwood's leather-bound journal open between them. The journal was remarkable in its preservation, each page filled with Blackwood's meticulous handwriting. His early entries from 1927 documented the Henry's growing suspicion that powerful forces were operating behind the scenes of major world events. "Listen to this," Sarah read aloud from an entry dated September 15. "The Great War was not the result of political tensions alone. It was deliberately engineered to reshape the world order according to their design." James shook his head in disbelief. "He's claiming that World War I was planned?" Sarah continued reading. "Blackwood writes that he obtained documents proving the architects had advanced knowledge of the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand. More than that, they had agents in place to ensure the conflict would escalate into a global war. The implications were staggering. If Blackwood's claims were true, then the deaths of millions of people had been orchestrated by a secret organization for their own purposes. But why? James asked. What could they possibly gain from such devastation? Sarah flipped through several pages, looking for Blackwood's explanation. She found it in an entry from October 9. "Here," she said. He writes, "The architects operate on a principle they call controlled evolution. They believe that human society must be guided through carefully managed crises to achieve what they consider optimal development. Wars, eliminate excess population, economic collapses, consolidated wealth and power, and technological suppression ensures that advancement occurs only when and how they choose. The journal detailed Blackwood's investigation into specific members of the architects. They have identified key figures in banking, industry, and government who were coordinating their activities across national boundaries. The scope of their influence was breathtaking. "Look at this list," James said, pointing to a page covered with names and connections. Blackwood mapped out their entire network. Banking families, industrial dynasties, political figures. They had people in every major power center. Sarah studied the organization chart Blackwood had drawn. Links connected names across different countries and industries, showing how the architects maintained control through a web of relationships and mutual interest. The chart revealed a structure more sophisticated than either of them had imagined. At the center were what Blackwood called the inner circle. 12 families who had been directing the organization since its inception in the late. Surrounding them were regional directors who managed operations in different parts of the world, and beneath them were hundreds of operatives who carried out specific tasks without necessarily understanding the larger plan. This explains how they could suppress technology, she realized. If they controlled the major industrial and financial institutions, they could simply buy up patents, fund research in directions they approved of, and eliminate scientists who discovered things they wanted to keep hidden. One entry from November 1923 made Sarah's blood run cold. Blackwood had written, "I have been invited to attend one of their gatherings. They believe I am sympathetic to their cause, thanks to my carefully cultivated persona as a journalist interested in progressive social engineering. This may be my only chance to obtain photographic evidence of their activities." "That must be when he took the photograph we found," James said. Sarah turned the page and found Blackwood's account of the meeting. His description of the event matched the settings shown in the photograph, but his written account revealed details that the image couldn't capture. He described seeing technology that was decades ahead of its time. Sarah, communication devices that could transmit messages instantly across continents, vehicles that moved without visible means of propulsion, and most shocking of all, what he calls thinking machines that could process information and make decisions like human beings. Computers, James breathed. He's describing computers in 1923. The journal entry continued with Blackwood's growing horror as he realized the full scope of what the architects possessed. They had access to technology that could have revolutionized human civilization, but they were keeping it secret to maintain their control over society's development. "Listen to this," Sarah continued. Blackwood writes, "I now understand their true purpose. They are not merely seeking wealth or political power. They are attempting to direct the evolution of human civilization itself. They believe that releasing advanced technology too quickly would lead to chaos and the collapse of social order. So they parcel it out slowly, ensuring that each advancement serves their ultimate vision of a perfectly controlled society." The journal revealed that the architects had developed what they called the 100-year plan, a detailed roadmap for human development. They had anticipated and planned for major technological breakthroughs, social movements, and even global conflicts decades in advance. "Look at this," James said, pointing to a page filled with dates and predictions. Blackwood copied part of their timeline. They predicted the development of television, jet aircraft, nuclear weapons, computers, and the internet, all with remarkable accuracies. Sarah studied the timeline with growing amazement and horror. The architects hadn't just been reacting to technological developments, they had been orchestrating them. Every major innovation of the 20th century had been part of their carefully planned sequence of controlled releases. But some of these dates are wrong, she noticed. According to this timeline, We should have had personal computers in the 1960s, the internet in the 1960s, and artificial intelligence in the 19... Or maybe they deliberately delayed things even more than they originally planned, Sarah replied grimly. The final entries in the journal became increasingly frantic. Blackwood had realized that his cover was blown and that the architects knew he had been documenting their activities. His last entry, dated December 3, 1923, was barely legible. They know I have hidden copies of everything, the photographs, the documents, the proof of their crimes against humanity. If something happens to me, I pray that someday someone will find this evidence and expose the truth. The world deserves to know what has been stolen from them. Beneath this final entry, Blackwood had drawn a map of London, marking several locations with cryptic symbols. Sarah recognized some of the landmarks, but others had been altered or destroyed in the centuries since the map was drawn. James, I think, Blackwood, additional evidence in these locations. If we can find it, we might have enough proof to expose the architects once and for all. But as they studied the map more closely, Sarah noticed something that made her heart race. One of the marquee locations was her own apartment building in Bloomsbury. Blackwood had hidden something there, and somehow, through a century of changes and coincidences, she had ended up living directly above it. Sarah closed the journal, her hands trembling. The weight of Blackwood's sacrifice pressed down on her. He had died trying to expose a truth that could have changed the course of human history. We have to finish what he started, she said quietly. We owe it to him, and to everyone who has suffered because of the architect's manipulation. James nodded, but his expression was troubled. Sarah, if this organization has survived for a century, if they really have the kind of power and influence Blackwood described, then we're not just risking our careers by pursuing this, we're risking our lives. Sarah looked at the photograph in the journal, thinking about all the technological advances that could have improved millions of lives, all the wars that might have been prevented, all the suffering that could have been avoided if the truth had been known. Then we'd better be very careful about how we proceed, she said, because the world needs to know the truth, no matter what it costs us. Sarah spent the next 3 days conducting research from her flat, using every digital resource at her disposal to trace the modern descendants of the architects. What she discovered was a web of influence that stretched across every major industry and government in the world. The family names from Blackwood's journal had evolved into corporate dynasties and political legacies that continued to shape global events. Whitfield Industries, descended from Charles Whitfield, had become a technology giant with contracts in defense, communications, and artificial intelligence. The Harrington banking family now controlled one of the world's largest investment firms. The Ashford political dynasty had produced senators, cabinet members, and even a president, but it was the connections between these families that revealed the true scope of their continued influence. Buyed memberships, charitable foundations, think tanks, and policy institutes. They had created an interlocking network of organizations that allowed them to coordinate their activities while maintaining the appearance of independence. Sarah's laptop chimed with an encrypted message from James. They had agreed to communicate and only through secure channels, and even then, only when absolutely necessary. Found something important. Meet me at the British Library, Reading Room G. Come along. An hour later, Sarah found James hunched over a stack of historical documents in the library's most secure research area. His face was pale, and his hands shook slightly as he gestured for her to sit down. I've been researching the technology described in Blackwood's journal, he whispered. He wanted to understand how advanced it really was compared to what was publicly available in the internet. He pulled out a folder filled with photocopied documents. These are patent applications from the 1990s that were never approved. Look at the names on the application. Sarah examined the documents. The inventors' names were unfamiliar, but the technology they described was remarkably advanced. radio communication systems that wouldn't be developed until the Ninicentabwantes, computing machines that resembled early computers, even theoretical designs for jet propulsion. "Now look at this," James said, pulling out another set of documents. "These are corporate acquisition records from the same period. Every one of these inventors either sold their patents to companies controlled by architects' families, or they simply disappeared. The pattern was clear and chilling. The architects had been systematically acquiring advanced technology and either suppressing it entirely or releasing it only when it served their purposes. But James, this is from a century ago. Surely they can't still be operating the same way today." James pulled out his tablet and showed her a series of news articles from the past decade. Tech startup founders who died in suspicious accidents just before major breakthroughs. Scientists who abandoned promising research after receiving lucrative offers from major corporations. Patent applications that disappeared into legal limbo. Sarah studied the articles with growing horror. The methods had evolved, but the pattern remained the same. Advanced technology was still being suppressed or controlled by the same network of families and organizations that Blackwood had identified in. "There's more," James continued. "I've been tracking the flow of research funding in emerging technologies. Artificial intelligence, quantum computing, advanced energy systems, the major funding sources all trace back to organizations controlled by descendants of the architects. So they're not just suppressing technology anymore, they're directing it." "Exactly. They've learned that complete suppression is too difficult in the modern world. Instead, they fund the research they want. They starve the projects they don't. They control the pace and direction of technological development. By controlling the money, Sarah thought about the implications. If the architects could direct technological development, they could ensure that advances serve their interests rather than humanity's broader needs. They could maintain their control over society by carefully managing the tools that society had access to. James showed her a complex flowchart he had created, mapping the funding sources for major technology companies. "Look at this network. Every major tech company receives funding from venture capital firms, investment banks, or government contracts that ultimately trace back to architects-controlled organizations." The flowchart revealed a sophisticated system of financial control that would have been impossible to detect without Blackwood's journal as a guide. The architects had learned to hide their influence behind layers of intermediary organizations, making it appear that technological development was driven by market forces and academic research rather than centralized planning. "We need to find current evidence," Sarah said. "Blackwood's journal and the photograph probably what happened in 1923, but we need proof that this conspiracy is still active today." James nodded and pulled out one final document. "I think I know where to start. There's a technology conference happening next week in Geneva. The attendee list reads like a who's who of the architects' descendants. If they're still coordinating their activities, this would be the perfect cover for a modern gathering." Sarah studied the conference again. On the surface, it appeared to be a legitimate forum for discussing emerging technologies and their social implications. But when she looked at the speaker list and the organizing committee, she recognized names from her research into the architects' modern network. "This could be our chance to get inside their operation," she said. "But it's also incredibly dangerous. If they're still eliminating people who get too close to the truth, then we'd better make sure we get the evidence we need before they realize what we're doing." Sarah noticed something else about the conference that made her suspicious. The venue was the same building where the League of Nations had held its meetings in the 1920s, the same building that appeared in the background of Blackwood's photograph. The architects were rather incredibly arrogant, or they were sending a message to anyone who might be watching. "James, look at this," she said, showing him the conference venue information. "They're meeting in the exact same place where Blackwood photographed them a century ago. That can't be a coincidence." "No, it can't. They want us to know they're still operating. They want us to understand that they've been in control all along. As they prepared to leave the library, Sarah noticed a man in a dark suit who had been sitting at a nearby table throughout their meeting. He had appeared to be reading, but she realized he hadn't turned a page in over an hour. "James," she whispered, "we're being watched." They gathered their materials casually, trying not to appear rushed. As they walked toward the exit, Sarah glanced back and saw the man speaking quietly into a phone. The game had changed. The architects knew they were investigating, and the stakes were about to get much higher. But Sarah was more determined than ever to expose the truth. The conference in Geneva would be their chance to gather the evidence they needed to prove that the conspiracy Blackwood had died trying to expose was still active today. The photograph from 1993 had been just the beginning. Now they were about to confront the architects face to face in the very place where their secret had first been captured on film. The flight to Geneva gave Sarah time to review their plan. Though calling it a plan was generous, they had managed to secure press credentials for the Global Technology Summit through James's connections at an academic journal, but once they were inside, they would be operating blind. Sarah had spent the past week studying the conference attendees, memorizing faces and backgrounds of the key figures she suspected were modern architects. David Whitfield would be giving the keynote address on responsible innovation in the digital age, a title that struck her as deeply ironic given what she knew about his family's history. The Palais des Nations provided an appropriately grand setting for what Sarah suspected was a gathering of the world's most powerful secret society. The conference's public sessions were being held in the main auditorium, but she was more interested in the private meetings and closed-door sessions that weren't listed on the official agenda. James had arrived separately and was posing as a technology journalist, while Sarah was representing herself as a historian researching the social impact of technological change. Their cover stories were thin, but they hoped the chaos of a large conference would provide sufficient camouflage. On the second day of the conference, Sarah noticed a pattern in the movements of certain attendees. While most participants moved freely between sessions, a select group of individuals seemed to follow a different schedule. They attended the public sessions sporadically, but they all disappeared during specific time blocks when nothing was officially scheduled. Following her instincts, Sarah tracked one of these individuals, Margaret Harrington, whose great-grandfather had been mentioned in Blackwood's journal as a key architect. During a lunch break, instead of heading to the dining area, Harrington walked purposefully toward a restricted section of the building. Sarah followed at a distance, her heart pounding as she ventured into areas clearly marked as off-limits to conference attendees. The corridors were quieter here, with fewer people and more security cameras. She was beginning to think she had made a terrible mistake when she heard voices coming from behind a closed door. Finding an adjacent room that appeared to be empty, Sarah slipped inside and pressed her ear to the wall. The voices were muffled, but she could make out enough to confirm her worst fears. Technological release schedule remains on track. The artificial intelligence developments will be limited to commercial applications for at least another decade. The energy breakthrough in Munich has been contained. The research team has accepted our acquisition offer. Social media algorithms are performing as expected. Public discourse continues to fragment along the lines we've established. Sarah's blood ran cold as she realized she was listening to a discussion about controlling and manipulating technological development on a global scale. The architects weren't just suppressing individual innovations. They were orchestrating the entire trajectory of human technological progress. She pulled out her phone and began recording, though she knew the audio quality would be poor through the wall. Every word she could capture would be crucial evidence of the conspiracy's continued existence. The conversation continued for nearly an hour, covering topics that ranged from specific technological suppression to broader social manipulation. They discussed economic policies, media narratives, and political movements as if they were chess pieces to be moved according to their grand strategy. The climate change narrative is proceeding as planned, one voice said. Public concern is high enough to justify increased government control over energy policy, but not so high as to demand immediate technological solutions. Excellent. and the space exploration programs, carefully managed. We are allowing enough progress to maintain public interest and national prestige, but nothing that would lead to genuine independence from Earth-based resources. Sarah realized she was listening to a conversation about managing humanity's entire future. The architects weren't just controlling current technology. They were planning decades ahead, ensuring that human development followed their predetermined path. What about the quantum computing research at MIT? Another voice asked. Under control, we've redirected their funding toward theoretical applications that won't threaten our cryptographic systems. The practical applications will remain classified for at least another 20 years. The scope of their control was breathtaking. They were managing not just technological development, but public perception, government policy, and even scientific research priorities. Every aspect of human progress was being carefully orchestrated to serve their vision of controlled evolution. When the meeting finally ended, Sarah heard chairs scraping and footsteps moving toward the door. She quickly moved away from the wall and pretended to be examining documents at a desk, her heart racing as she waited for the corridor to clear. Once she was certain the area was empty, Sarah made her way back to the main conference area. She needed to find James and share what she had discovered, but she also needed to be careful not to draw attention to herself. She found James in the exhibition hall, apparently engrossed in a conversation with a technology vendor. When he saw her approaching, he smoothly concluded his conversation and joined her at a quiet corner near the coffee station. I found them, Sarah whispered. They're here, and they're still operating exactly as Blackwood described. I have recordings. James' eyes widened. Are you certain? The risk you took, it was worth it. James, they're not just controlling technology, they're manipulating society on every level. Economic policies, media narratives, political movements, it's all part of their plan to direct human development. Before James could respond, Sarah noticed David Whitfield approaching their location. He was accompanied by two men in dark suits who looked more like security personnel than conference attendees. Dr. Mitchell, isn't it? Whitfield said with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. I understand you're researching the historical impact of technological change. How fascinating. I'd love to discuss your work with you. Sarah's mouth went dry. There was no way Whitfield should have known who she was or what she was researching. Her cover had been blown. I'm afraid I have another appointment, she said, trying to keep her voice steady. Oh, he insisted, Whitfield replied, and the two men moved closer. I think you'll find our conversation quite illuminating. Sarah looked around desperately for an escape route, but the exhibition hall was crowded, and Whitfield's men had positioned themselves to block her exit. She was trapped, and she knew that whatever happened next would determine whether Blackwood's truth would finally be revealed or buried forever. The photograph from Nentes Tres had led them to this moment, a direct confrontation with the same conspiracy that had claimed Theodore Blackwood's life a century earlier. Now Sarah would discover whether the truth was powerful enough to overcome 100 years of carefully maintained secrecy. The private conference room felt more like an interrogation chamber than a meeting space. David Whitfield sat across from Sarah, his demeanor calm and controlled, while the two security personnel stood by the door. James had been separated from her and taken to another room, ostensibly for his own conversation. Dr. Mitchell, Whitfield began, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. You've been asking some very interesting questions lately, questions about things that are better left undisturbed. Sarah forced herself to maintain eye contact, drawing on every ounce of courage she possessed. I'm a historian. Asking questions is what I do. Indeed, and your research into Theodore Blackwood has been quite thorough. Impressive even. Whitfield leaned back in his chair, but you've stumbled into matters that are far more complex than you realize. Complex enough to murder people who get too close to the truth? Whitfield's expression didn't change. Theodore Blackwood was a brilliant man, but he lacked perspective. He saw conspiracy where there was actually careful stewardship. He saw suppression where there was actually protection. Protection. Sarah couldn't hide her disbelief. You call suppressing technology that could have saved millions of lives protection. I call it responsibility. Whitfield stood and walked to the window, gazing out at the Geneva skyline. Dr. Mitchell, imagine what would have happened if the technology Blackwood witnessed in 1923 had been released to the world immediately. Advanced computing, instantaneous global communication, artificial intelligence, all in the hands of a world that had just emerged from the most devastating war in human history. Sarah remained silent, sensing that Whitfield was about to reveal more than he intended. The Great War showed us what humanity does with advanced technology when it's not properly guided. Machine guns, poison gas, aircraft used for bombing. Every innovation turned into a weapon. Now imagine if that same mentality had access to truly advanced technology. So you decided to play God, Sarah said, to determine what humanity was ready for and when. We decided to be responsible guardians of human progress. Whitfield turned back to face her. Every technology we've controlled, every innovation we've delayed, every development we've redirected, it's all been in service of ensuring that human civilization develops in a stable, sustainable way. And who gave you the right to make those decisions? Who gave anyone the right? But someone has to make them, Dr. Mitchell. Left to its own devices, humanity would have destroyed itself decades ago. We've prevented nuclear wars, economic collapses, and technological disasters that would have set civilization back centuries. Sarah thought about the recordings on her phone, the evidence of manipulation and control she had gathered. And the wars you've caused, the economic collapses you've orchestrated, the suffering you've created. Whitfield's facade of calm cracked slightly. Necessary adjustments. Sometimes society requires correction, a controlled crisis that prevents a larger catastrophe. It's not pleasant, but it's necessary. You're talking about millions of deaths, as if they were acceptable losses in some grand experiment. I'm talking about billions of lives saved through careful management of human development. Whitfield returned to his seat, his composure restored. Dr. Mitchell, you have a choice to make. You can continue pursuing this investigation and face the same fate as Theodore Blackwood, or you can join us. Join you? Your research skills are impressive. Your understanding of historical patterns is valuable. We could use someone with your expertise to help us guide humanity's next phase of development. Sarah stared at him in disbelief. You're offering me a position in your conspiracy. I'm offering you a chance to be part of something larger than yourself, to help shape the future of human civilization in a positive way, by suppressing technology and manipulating society, by ensuring that technology serves humanity's best interests rather than its worst impulses. Whitfield leaned forward. Dr. Mitchell, we're not the villains in this story. We're the guardians who have kept humanity from destroying itself for over a century. Sarah thought about everything she had learned, the suppressed innovations, the manipulated events, the lives lost to maintain the architect's control. She thought about Theodore Blackwood, who had died trying to expose the truth. And if I refuse, Whitfield's expression hardened. Then you'll be remembered as a brilliant historian who tragically died in a car accident while traveling in Switzerland. Your research will be lost, your discoveries forgotten, and the world will continue on its carefully guided path. The threat was clear, but Sarah had already made her decision. She had come too far to back down now, and she owed it to Blackwood's memory to see this through to the end. "I need time to consider your offer," she said, hoping to buy herself some breathing room. "Of course, but don't take too long, Dr. Mitchell. Time is a luxury that people in your position rarely have." Whitfield gestured to his security personnel, who moved to escort Sarah from the room. As they walked through the corridors of the Palais des Nations, Sarah couldn't help but think about the irony of the situation. She was being threatened in the same building where the League of Nations had once met to promote international cooperation and peace, ideals that the architects had apparently been undermining for decades. One more thing, Dr. Mitchell, Whitfield called after her. Your friend, Professor Whitmore, has already accepted our offer. He's agreed to turn over all of his research and to cease his investigation immediately. I hope you'll make the same wise choice. Sarah's heart sank. If James had really betrayed their investigation, then she was truly alone. But something in Whitfield's tone suggested he might be lying, trying to break her resolve by making her think she had been abandoned. As she was escorted back to the main conference area, Sarah's mind raced with possibilities. She still had the recordings from the secret meeting, and she had managed to gather enough evidence to prove that the architects were still active. But she needed to find a way to get that evidence to the outside world before Whitfield's people could stop her. The photograph from 1923 had trailed this journey, and now Sarah was living through her own version of Theodore Blackwood's final days. The question was whether she would suffer the same fate, or whether she could find a way to expose the truth that had been hidden for over a century. The weight of history pressed down on her as she realized that the future of human civilization might depend on what she did in the next few hours. Sarah was escorted back to her hotel room under the watchful eyes of Whitfield's security team. They made it clear that she was being monitored, but they allowed her the illusion of freedom while she considered the offer to join the architects. What they didn't know was that Sarah had prepared for this possibility. Before leaving London, she had uploaded all of her research, including Blackwood's journal and an intelligent photograph, to a secure cloud server with instructions for automatic release if she failed to check in within 48 hours. She also had one more card to play. Using a secure communication app on her phone, Sarah contacted Dr. Elena Vasquez, an investigative journalist she had met at a conference the previous year. Elena specialized in exposing corporate corruption and had the resources and connections to get the story out quickly. Elena, I need your help. I have evidence of a conspiracy that goes back over a century, but I'm in immediate danger. If something happens to me, I need you to tell this story. Within hours, Elena had arrived in Geneva with a small team of trusted colleagues. Sarah met them in a crowded cafe, choosing a public location where the architect's surveillance would be more difficult. She handed Elena a flash drive containing copies of all her research. This is everything: Blackwood's journal, the photograph, the recordings from the conference, genealogical charts showing the modern network. It's all there. Elena reviewed the materials on her laptop, her expression growing more serious with each document. Sarah, this is incredible. If even half of this is true, it's the story of the century. It's all true. And there's more. Sarah told Elena about her confrontation with Whitfield and the offer to join the architects. They're going to try to silence me, but the story needs to get out. What do you want me to do? Publish everything. Make it impossible for them to suppress the truth anymore. Elena nodded. I need 24 hours to verify some of the details and prepare the story for publication. Can you stay safe that long? I'll try. As Sarah prepared to leave the cafe, her phone buzzed with a message from James. They let me go. Meet me at the train station. We need to get out of Geneva immediately. Sarah found James waiting nervously by the departure boards. His face was pale, and his hands shook as he spoke. They offered me the same deal they offered you, he said. Join them or face the consequences. I told them I needed time to think, but I don't think they believe me. It doesn't matter. Elena is going to publish the story tomorrow. Once it is public, they won't be able to silence us without confirming everything we've exposed. They boarded the next train to Paris, hoping to put distance between themselves and the architect's immediate reach. As the Swiss countryside rolled past their window, Sarah reflected on everything they had discovered. The photograph from it had led them to uncover a conspiracy that had shaped human history for over a century, controlling technological development and manipulating social progress according to the vision of a small group of powerful families. But now the truth was about to be revealed to the world. The next morning, Elena's story broke simultaneously across multiple news platforms and social media channels. The headline read, "Shocking photo from Mint Pinterest reveals the biggest secret in history. Century-old conspiracy controls human progress." The response was immediate and overwhelming. The photograph, Blackwood's journal, and the evidence of the architect's continued influence spread across the internet faster than any attempt at suppression could contain it. Social media exploded with discussions, analyses, and demands for investigation. Within hours, government officials were calling for inquiries, technology companies were facing questions about their research practices, and the descendants of the architects found themselves under intense scrutiny. David Whitfield held a press conference denying all allegations, but the evidence was too comprehensive and well documented to dismiss. Other members of the network remained silent, hoping the storm would pass, but the public outcry only grew stronger. Sarah watched the coverage from a safe house in Paris, amazed at how quickly the truth had spread once it was released. The very technology that the architects had tried to control was now being used to expose their conspiracy. "Do you think this will really change anything?" James asked as they watched the news coverage. "I think it's already changing everything," Sarah replied. "The architects' power came from operating in secret. Now that the world knows they exist, they can't manipulate events the same way." Over the following weeks, investigations were launched in multiple countries. Technology companies were forced to open their research practices to scrutiny. Academic institutions began reviewing their funding sources and research directions. The full extent of the architect's influence would take years to unravel, but the process had begun. Technologies that had been suppressed or delayed began to emerge as researchers felt free to pursue previously forbidden directions. Independent scientists started sharing research that had been buried for decades. Clean energy technologies that had been bought up and shelved by major corporations were suddenly being developed by new teams of researchers. Medical breakthroughs that had been delayed to protect pharmaceutical profits were fast-tracked into clinical trials. The impact was felt across every sector of society. Financial markets fluctuated wildly as investors tried to understand which companies had been artificially propped up by architects' manipulation and which had been unfairly suppressed. Political movements emerged demanding transparency in government funding and policy decisions. Sarah returned to Cambridge to find herself at the center of a media storm. The university had initially been skeptical of her claims, but the mounting evidence had forced them to acknowledge the significance of her discovery. She stood in her office, looking at the wall where she had hung a framed copy of the 1923 photograph, the image that had started it all. Theodore Blackwood's sacrifice had not been in vain. The truth he had died trying to expose was finally known to the world. The conspiracy that had controlled human progress for over a century was broken. The future was uncertain. But for the first time in generations, it belonged to humanity as a whole, rather than a select few who claimed to know what was best. As Sarah prepared for another interview about her discoveries, she thought about Blackwood's final journal entry and his hope that someday someone would find his evidence and expose the truth. That day had finally come. Epilogue, The New Dawn. Sarah stood before the packed auditorium at the Royal Institution in London, delivering what would become known as the Blackwood Lecture, a presentation that had drawn historians and government officials from around the world. The same photograph that had started her investigation was now projected on the massive screen behind her. Theodore Blackwood died, believing that truth would eventually prevail, she said, her voice carrying clearly through the hushed hall. Today, we see the vindication of that belief. But more importantly, we see the beginning of a new chapter in human development, one where progress serves humanity rather than the interests of a hidden few. The months following Elena's explosive revelation had transformed the global landscape in ways that even Sarah hadn't anticipated. The exposure of the architects had triggered what historians were already calling the Great Unveiling, a period of unprecedented transparency and technological acceleration. In the weeks after the story broke, whistleblowers from around the world had come forward with additional evidence. Former employees of architects, control companies revealed decades of suppressed research. Government officials admitted to receiving directives from shadow organizations. Scientists shared stories of promising research that had been mysteriously defunded or redirected. The most shocking revelation came from Dr. Marcus Chen, the elderly son of Professor William Chen, one of the scientists who had... Marcus had spent his entire life searching for traces of his father's work, and the exposure of the architects had finally given him the courage to come forward with documents he had hidden for decades. My father's research on artificial intelligence was 50 years ahead of its time, Chen testified before a congressional committee. He had developed working prototypes of thinking machines in 1923, but the architects made him disappear before he could share his discoveries with the world. The documents Chen provided showed detailed blueprints for mechanical computers that wouldn't be invented until the 1920s, along with theoretical frameworks for artificial intelligence that were only now being fully understood. His father's work proved that human technological capability had been deliberately held back for generations. Similar revelations emerged from other families of the disappeared scientists. Hidden laboratories, secret research facilities, and underground archives were discovered across Europe and North America. Each discovery revealed more evidence of technologies that had been developed decades before their official invention. The impact on the technology sector was immediate and dramatic. Stock prices of major tech companies plummeted as investors realized that many breakthrough innovations had actually been controlled releases of much older discoveries. Meanwhile, new companies formed almost daily as researchers rushed to develop the suppressed technologies that were now freely available. Clean energy research, in particular, experienced an explosive renaissance. Patents for advanced solar cells, revolutionary battery designs, and efficient fusion reactors, all dating back to the 19th. Amanda Foster, a physicist at MIT, had become one of the leading voices in what was being called the liberation science movement. "We're not just catching up to where we should have been," she explained in a widely viewed interview. "We're leapfrogging decades of controlled development." The technologies that the architects suppressed weren't just advanced for their time, they were revolutionary. The political ramifications were equally significant. Governments around the world faced intense pressure to investigate their own connections to the architects' network. Several high-ranking officials resigned when their ties to architects-controlled organizations were exposed. New transparency laws were passed, requiring disclosure of all funding sources for government research and policy development. But perhaps the most profound change was in public consciousness. The revelation that human progress had been artificially constrained for over a century had sparked a global awakening. People began questioning other accepted narratives about technological development, economic systems, and social progress. Sarah had received thousands of letters from researchers, inventors, and ordinary citizens who felt inspired by Blackwood's story to pursue their own suppressed ideas and innovation. The photograph from 1923 had become a symbol of hidden potential, a reminder that truth, no matter how deeply buried, would eventually surface. "The most important lesson we can learn from Theodore Blackwood," Sarah continued in her lecture, "is that individual courage can change the course of history. One journalist with a camera and the determination to seek truth was able to plant the seeds that would eventually topple a century-old conspiracy." As she spoke, Sarah noticed James Whitmore in the audience, smiling proudly at how far their investigation had come. Beside them sat Elena Vasquez, who had won multiple Bodolissima awards for her role in exposing the architects. In the front row, she spotted Dr. Marcus Chen, now in his 80s but with eyes bright with the satisfaction of seeing his father's work finally recognized. The question and answer session that followed was intense and wide-ranging. Audience members wanted to know about ongoing investigations, the status of suppressed technologies, and the long-term implications of the architect's exposure. Mitchell, asked a young woman from the BBC, "There are rumors that some members of the architects' network are still operating secret. Are you concerned about retaliation?" Sarah had, indeed, received threats in the months since the story broke, and security experts had advised her to maintain a low profile. But she had decided that hiding would only validate the architect's tactics of intimidation. The best protection against retaliation is continued transparency, she replied. The more people who know this story, the safer we all become. That's why education and public awareness are so crucial. A technology journalist raised his hand. What do you think the world would look like today if the architects had never existed? Sarah had thought about this question many times. It's impossible to know for certain, but based on the suppressed technologies we've discovered, we might have had sustainable energy systems decades ago, advanced medical treatments that could have saved millions of lives, and communication technologies that could have brought the world together, rather than dividing it. But she continued, we can't change the past. What we can do is ensure that the future develops according to humanity's collective wisdom, rather than the agenda of a hidden few. An elderly man in the back of the auditorium stood up. Dr. Mitchell, I'm a retired engineer, and I've been working on energy storage technology for 40 years. After your revelations, I discovered that my grandfather had developed similar technology in the 1930s, but his research was bought up by a company that buried it. How many other families have similar stories? Probably thousands, Sarah replied sadly. One of the most tragic aspects of this conspiracy is how many brilliant minds were silenced or redirected away from their true potential. But now that we know the truth, we can honor their memory by ensuring their discoveries finally see the light of day. The lecture concluded with a standing ovation that lasted several minutes. As the audience filed out, many people approached Sarah to share their own stories of suppressed research. Mysterious funding cuts, or family members whose promising careers had been inexplicably derailed. Later that evening, Sarah returned to her flat in Bloomsbury, the same building where Theodore Blackwood had hidden evidence nearly a century earlier. She had finally excavated the basement location marked on his map and discovered a waterproof container filled with additional photographs, documents, and even a primitive recording device that Blackwood had used to capture conversations at architects' meetings. These additional materials had provided crucial corroboration for the evidence in his journal, but more importantly, they had revealed Blackwood's final message to future generations. In a letter dated just days before his disappearance, he had written, "To whoever finds this evidence, do not let my death be in vain. The truth is more powerful than any conspiracy, but only if brave souls are willing to speak it." The future of human civilization depends not on the plans of hidden rulers, but on the courage of ordinary people to demand transparency, justice, and freedom. Use this evidence wisely, and remember that every generation must fight to preserve truth. For the next, Sarah kept this letter framed on her desk as a daily reminder of the responsibility that came with knowledge. The exposure of the architects was just the beginning. The real work lay in building systems and institutions that would prevent such conspiracies from forming again. Over the following months, Sarah worked with governments, universities, and international organizations to establish new protocols for research transparency, technology development, and historical preservation. The Blackwood Protocols, as they came to be known, required open publication of research findings, democratic oversight of technology development, and protection for whistleblowers who exposed suppressed information. The photograph from 1923 was now displayed in the British Museum as part of a permanent exhibition on hidden history and the power of truth. Millions of visitors came to see the image that had changed the world, but more importantly, they came to learn about the importance of questioning official narratives and seeking evidence for themselves. Sarah often stood before the display case, watching children and adults alike study the photograph with fascination. She thought about how one moment, captured on film, had ultimately liberated human potential that had been constrained for generations. The biggest secret in history was secret, no more. But Sarah knew that vigilance would be required to ensure that new secrets didn't take its place. The price of progress, she had learned, was eternal transparency. As she walked home through the London streets, Sarah reflected on how much the world had changed since that foggy November morning when James had called her to the museum. The future was no longer being written by a hidden few. It belonged to humanity as a whole. Theodore Blackwood's sacrifice had finally borne fruit, and the truth he died protecting would continue to illuminate the path forward for generations to come.